Good morning and welcome to the Zoom service of UUCC, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua. UUCC is a congregation that fosters personal and spiritual growth through religious exploration in search of the truth while celebrating diversity and affirming the worth and dignity of every person. We're glad that you are joining us. I'm Danielle Lyon, one of your worship coordinators. Our speaker today is Megan Cabral, who is raised Jewish, but has been a member of UUCC for about 5 years. She's a Spanish teacher who lives in Canandaigua with her husband, Paulo, daughter, Maria, and another little one due in November.
All right, a few quick announcements. The first one is that there is a church cleanup party that the board is putting together, Pat Harris specifically putting together today. From 4 to 6 p.m. Meeting at the church. Also want to highlight that the Board of Trustees has a new date and time for their monthly meeting. It's going to be this Thursday, September 2nd, via Zoom, starting at 7 p.m. That's 7 p.m. And if you have any questions or would like to be involved, please reach out to our president, Brandon Steele. And then lastly, I wanted to mention Dorothy will be volunteering with the Catholic Family Services to support Afghan refugees and can deliver donations. So please reach out to Dorothy if you'd like to participate in that. All right, now for our Chalice Light. We gather this hour as people of faith with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning in celebration of the life we share together.
Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us for today's service. I'm honored and a little intimidated to be doing my first service ever today. I'm going to share with you some experiences and reflections on living in an interfaith family, which, while not always simple or ideal, definitely has its benefits. I have been surprised to be moved to tears, for example, at services I've attended at my husband Paulo's Christian church. And Paulo has been able to support the UUCC's migrant justice work by cooking and delivering meals to local migrant workers with Dorothy and Jeff. Both faiths call their followers to love others as they would themselves, whether through Jesus's teachings or the first principle of UUism. But in practice, that can be a little trickier than it would seem to truly embrace diverse beliefs as just as true and valid as one's own, and to avoid pigeonholing others into the confines of stereotypes. Each of us has our own complex story, and what we believe about the big questions of life is just one piece of who we are. And I've come to think of our spiritual communities as part of our extended families, each different and with their own lessons and challenges. So I'd like to start us off today with a short poem called God's Light, an Interfaith Poem by Elisa Spray. God's light shines right down, filling my whole soul. Yahweh's light shines out, guiding to the goal. Father's light guides to goodwill and our peace. Buddhist light aims for inner growth increase. Ram's light shines through these bodies we lease. Confucius will say, as long as right exists, may the Tao or Tao always part the mists. Divine light flows free, whoever you be.
We will now have our first hymn, Bill Mills, playing Come, Come, Whoever You Are.
Thanks, Bill, if you're out there. I know it's pre-recorded, but all right, so we have a story for all ages today called Yafa and Fatima, Shalom Salam. It's by Fauzia Galani Williams and illustrated by Chera Fidel. And this story is said to have both Jewish and Arab origins. If you can see okay here. In a beautiful land called the land of milk and honey, there lived two neighbors. One was named Yafa and the other was named Fatima. Yafa and Fatima each owned a beautiful date grove. During the week, they worked very hard gathering their dates. On most days, Yafa and Fatima sold all their dates at the market and were able to buy plenty of tasty food to eat, which they often shared. Yafa loved Fatima's shawarma, and Fatima loved Yafa's schnitzel. Yafa prayed in the synagogue, and Fatima prayed in the mosque. They both loved God, and they both loved to follow God's way. Yafa would read from her Siddur in the morning, and Fatima would read from her Quran in the morning. Yafa fasted on Yom Kippur, and Fatima fasted during Ramadan. Fatima celebrated Eid. Yafa celebrated Passover. When Yafa saw Fatima, she would wave and call, "Peace, shalom." When Fatima saw Yafa, she would wave and call, "Salam, peace." One year, there was very little rain. Fatima and Yafa had very few dates to eat or to sell at the market. Yafa lay awake at night. She was worried. Maybe Fatima's hungry, thought Yafa. Fatima lay awake at night too. She was worried. Perhaps Yafa didn't have enough to eat today, thought Fatima. Fatima placed a basket of dates on her donkey. Then she took them to Yafa's house. She poured the dates into a basket on Yafa's porch. Meanwhile, Yafa collected a basket of dates, placed it on her donkey, and carried it to Fatima's house. She poured the dates into a basket on Fatima's porch. The two neighbors quietly made their way back home, feeling happy. Oh, I covered one. They're both walking home there. In the morning, when Yafa went onto her porch, to her great surprise, she saw her basket full of dates. Goodness, I have so many dates. I will take more to Fatima tonight. Meanwhile, Fatima walked out onto her porch and was just as surprised. Goodness, I have more dates than I thought. I will take more to Yafa tonight. That night, both Yafa and Fatima loaded their donkeys with dates and set off toward each other's homes. They met just where their fields came together. Fatima looked at Yafa. Yafa looked at Fatima. The two friends hugged each other and laughed. Shalom, said Yafa. Salam, said Fatima. Thank you for thinking of me, said Yafa. Thank you for thinking of me too, said Fatima. Together, they returned to Yafa's house to share a meal of dates and tea. The end.
We are a community that holds one another in our celebrations and in our pain. Please share your joys and sorrows in the chat box in Zoom, and know whatever your heart is holding today, we are with you. For the joys and sorrows we share and those held in our heart, know that we are with you. I'd like to especially recall spending time with friends, all of us coming together in church, concerns over family health, concerns over refugees and families overseas, celebrating birthdays, celebrating new stages in life. All of these we hold together in our hearts.
Now is the time in our service to join together in the spiritual practice of generosity. Our gifts support our church in its work. That work is summarized in our covenant. The covenant for UUCC says, in service of the values that unite us, we will recognize the inherent value of each person, foster a community of compassion and caring for all, value our diverse opinions, and engage respectfully in all interactions. If you would like to give to this morning's offering, you can give online at canandaiguauu.org/connect or physically by mailing a check to the church. In either case, note if you'd like your gift to go toward the Sunday offering or your pledge. We'll share 25% of it with our monthly Sunday offerings with our service partner. The designated offering recipient chosen by Team 6 for August 2021 is the Finger Lakes Watershed Alliance. The purpose of the Finger Lakes Watershed Alliance is to bring together the members' expertise and desires of the Finger Lakes Watershed Associations to preserve and protect their watersheds with a collective regional voice, to join forces to advocate for mutually beneficial regional changes backed by sound research, and to promote collective actions that represent the desires of the entire Finger Lakes region.
For our centering and meditation today, I'm going to read a prayer from the book Talking to God by Naomi Levy, and it's called A Prayer for Tolerance. Teach us, God, to treasure the differences that distinguish one person from another. Fill us with the strength to overcome senseless fear and hatred. Open our hearts to the radiance that shines forth from every human soul. Inspire us to shed our apathy. Remind us that it is our obligation to be responsible for one another. Open our ears to the cries of all who are in need of our assistance. Give us the courage to combat prejudice and intolerance wherever they exist. Teach us to see each other through your eyes, God. In your eyes, all people are equally loved, equally precious. Bless us all, God, with compassion, with kindness, and with peace. Amen. When my husband, Paulo, and I got engaged and began to plan our wedding, we were confronted with the dilemma of having been brought up in very different faith traditions and having to decide what the religious and spiritual aspects of our ceremony would look like. At the time, I identified as Jewish and Paulo identified as Christian, but neither of us was actively participating in a faith community, and religious practice did not occupy a major space in either of our lives. So this was really the first time we had to kind of figure this stuff out. First, a little background. My family is Reformed Jewish. My father born to German-American Jews, and my mother having converted from the Presbyterian faith when she married my father. As she describes it, they had discussed how to handle faith when they got married and felt it would be easier for their future kids to handle if there were one faith practice in the home, and she mostly liked the teachings of Judaism. In practice, neither of them has ever been very religious, nor are they necessarily believers that there is even a God at this point in life, but both do believe in the golden rule, treating others with kindness and empathy, and trying to do good in this world where possible. Throughout my childhood, they put a good amount of effort into teaching us about Judaism and its traditions and values. Because we lived in a very small, rural, very Christian town with the nearest synagogue no less than 45 minutes away, way too far to schlep 4 kids every week for services, they also found themselves having to work extra hard to even remind us that we weren't Christian like everyone else in town. We were allowed to join in the celebrations of our friends if they invited us to an Easter egg hunt or a Christmas party, but we did not have a Christmas tree, and were not allowed to hang up the artwork sent home from school with Easter eggs or Christmas angels, because my parents didn't want us to become confused about our religious identity. We were, though, always taught to respect the faith traditions of others. Once, when we had an au pair living with us from Germany who shared that in her hometown on Christmas Eve, they would put out their shoes for St. Nick to fill with candy during the night, my mother said they should leave their shoes out while with us and perhaps St. Nick would visit. My youngest brother, Daniel, who was probably 4 or 5 at the time, of course wanted in on the fun and put his shoes out too. My mother warned him that Santa Claus only visits Christians, not Jews, because Jews don't celebrate Christmas, but he put his shoes out anyways. Lo and behold, on Christmas morning, the au pair's shoes had candy, but Dan's were empty. So while we didn't attend services regularly at a synagogue or keep kosher, and only celebrated a few major holidays, we were always reminded that we were indeed Jewish, not Christian. Paulo's family, on the other hand, are devout Christians, very involved in their town's Presbyterian church, which was actually founded by Paulo's great-grandfather. Paulo's mother converted from Catholicism when she married his father, and they were very invested in raising their children in the church community. Paulo and his siblings attended a Presbyterian school. They participated in youth groups and church summer camps. They cooked and distributed meals through the church for the less fortunate in the community. They sponsored youth at the local orphanage through their church, and the whole family attended services at least once a week. At every family meal, they say grace, and at any major life moment, they say some of the most heartfelt, beautiful prayers I have ever heard. My sister-in-law, Gianni, just recently completed a master's degree in theology and has spoken to congregations in many different Presbyterian churches around Brazil. And although Paulo had not participated actively in a church here before our wedding, I don't know if I mentioned this, but he's from Brazil. So when he moved here, he wasn't involved in any church community, but he has always felt deeply connected to his faith in God and biblical teachings. His family has always been very welcoming to me as a Jewish person. My father-in-law occasionally introducing me to other relatives saying, "She's Jewish, one of the chosen people." So where did this leave us for our wedding ceremony? At the time, we opted to remove elements of religiosity to avoid conflict of interest. I didn't have any association with a rabbi, and Paulo's family knew a Presbyterian pastor living in the US who they liked very much. And so we asked him to do the ceremony, but keep it generic, mentioning God, but not the Bible or Jesus. And in general, chose not to include any specific religious traditions like the Jewish one of stomping on the wine glass for good fortune. And so went our ceremony, and we were happy with it. It was a beautiful wedding with a fantastic party. We continued in our early years of marriage to live our lives outside of the realm of faith communities or much faith practice at all for the most part, though I had welcomed the practice of prayer into my life. Though I wasn't sure I believed in a God, I recognized that the humility and gratitude involved in prayer seemed like such a wholesome and grounding act, especially when done in a way that it brings people together in the moment. I've always loved that about prayer. I had also conceded in conversation at some point that I would be willing to attend a church down the road, since I never really had a tradition of attending a synagogue the way Paulo had with church. And I essentially saw all places of faith as trying to aim for similar goals. Now I know that I was a UU at heart and just didn't realize it yet because I had no idea at the time that something like UUism even existed. Fast forward 8 years to when we were expecting our first child. All of a sudden, it was time to pick a faith home for our budding family. We began the process of shopping around for a church in our area, and fairly quickly it became clear that we had different feelings on how that process should go. Paulo is more of the mentality that ultimately the question isn't which church you attend, but how you live your life. So it's not a life or death decision which church you choose, as long as it's a Christian one. I, on the other hand, tend to overanalyze anything that feels like a big decision and was being extremely picky. This was a bit unfair because I was a Jew, or a Jewish person, who in reality was more of an agnostic, so no Christian church was going to fit me perfectly anyway. And I was examining every bit of their theology and every undertone of the sermons we listened to see which was the most palatable for me. Around that time, my mother had started attending this church, the UUCC, as her spirituality had continued to evolve, and she was seeking something more inclusive of different beliefs, and she suggested it to us. I was open to it, but for Paulo, it felt uncomfortable because it is not a Christian church in the sense of focusing only on the teachings of the Bible. So we resolved not to visit the UUCC at that time. We continued to shop around at Christian churches and did find a couple that felt like they would be possibilities. Unfortunately, right around that same time, when I was about 8 months pregnant, our daughter passed away in the womb unexpectedly and was born via C-section the day we discovered her passing. Even after an autopsy, doctors were never able to discern what had caused her death, which for me was actually helpful in processing it as simply and completely out of our hands. In the aftermath of that tragic loss, however, after having prayed together the entire pregnancy for her health and well-being, we couldn't help but ponder the questions of why? Why her? Why us? And if there is a God and everything happens for a reason, what, if any, lessons or messages are we supposed to be taking away from this? These questions are inherently spiritual ones, and we each did many things to heal from that experience, one of which being seeking solace in places of faith. As we did so in some of the Christian churches we had liked from our recent search, I just wasn't finding the comfort that made sense to me. And in this process, and with some newfound impatience for anything that didn't feel deeply right for me after what we'd been through, I visited the UUCC on my own. We both had so wanted to find a faith community that fit both of us, but we're beginning to realize that maybe it just wasn't in the cards. And for me, since the first time I entered the UUCC, I knew on some level that I had found my spiritual home. I still identify as ethnically Jewish, but the principles and beliefs of Unitarian Universalism are very much aligned with how I understood and felt spirituality. And a social justice focused community was something I had yearned for quite some time. Paulo was still clear in that attending a UU church was just not for him. And so we finally had to accept that we might have to agree to disagree on one sole faith home for our family, because neither of us wanted to prevent the other one from practicing their true beliefs. And so we have continued since then as an officially interfaith family, doing our best to honor what for each of us as unique individuals feels true, important, and spiritually nurturing. And although it's not necessarily an ideal setup, it feels more right than either avoiding religion altogether, leading us to miss out on that spiritual nurturing that we both need, or one of us trying to conform to what works for the other. And it has actually, I think, pushed both of us to grow and be more open-minded as a result. As I think back on what we've learned from living as, or sorry, we've learned from living as members of an interfaith family, now with a 3-year-old and another one on the way, a few important lessons come to mind. One has to do with setting, communicating, and respecting healthy boundaries. By noticing and communicating when we feel we need to clarify a boundary or a limit at which, I'm comfortable up until this point, we're able to actually engage in more meaningful experiences together than we would if we felt the need to avoid those experiences completely because they just didn't feel safe or comfortable. During a heart-to-heart with my beloved sister-in-law early in my relationship with Paulo, she asked if she could pray for me. I was still navigating how to handle being in a serious relationship with someone whose family practiced their faith so explicitly. So I felt the need to respond that yes, she could pray for me, but not if it was with the goal of converting me to Christianity, because I knew where I stood and have never liked proselytizing. She understood and respected my request and said her prayer, and I was able to receive it with an open and grateful heart. Had I not said anything, I would have probably either been gritting my teeth while she said it as I swallowed my desire for respect, or missed out on a profound moment of spiritual connection and love had I simply denied her request completely. Another example of this is when Paulo and I discussed what types of books we would read to our kids. Maria loves to be read to, and as Paulo has pretty severe dyslexia, I'm usually the one in charge of reading to her. Little did I know until he brought it up, Paulo was worried that because of my spiritual beliefs, I wouldn't read Bible stories to her, which are important to him that she learn about. When he finally said something, he acknowledged that it was a difficult request for him to bring up because he knew it wasn't my faith tradition, but that it would mean a lot to him if we could include those in our reading material. Once I knew that that was important to him, I shared that I was okay with doing that more, so he could rest at ease knowing that she would have that exposure even though I'm not Christian. So in addition to reading books that share stories of many different ethnic and spiritual traditions, we have 2 books of children's Bible stories that we read quite often, and Maria loves them. Well, I should say, she loves the specific stories that she always asks to read, because as with most toddlers, she loves repetition. So I'm quite the expert on the stories of Jesus's miraculous healing of Jairus's daughter and God's healing of Naaman's leprosy in the River Jordan, in case anyone's interested in a retelling after the service. Another lesson that I personally have learned has been in not hiding who we are. Now, my entire life, I have been taught that one significant difference between Christians and Jews is that Jews don't proselytize, and that that's a good thing because proselytizing is disrespectful of others' beliefs. I almost saw talking about or practicing one's faith in front of others outside of family and close friends as some sort of advertisement and avoided it altogether in an attempt to never seem even remotely close to pressuring someone into learning about my faith. But then a while back in my work as a high school Spanish teacher, I was approached by a parent in the community whose high schooler had missed a good amount of school due to an injury, and for whom they wanted to find a tutor to ensure the student passed their final exam. I agreed, and we planned for them to meet in our home for a few sessions. As I was tidying up a bit before they came, I noticed Paulo's Bible out on the coffee table in our living room. Without thinking much of it, I grabbed the Bible and put it in our bedroom on his bedside table, not wanting the space to feel preachy. When he came home that night, he approached me indignant and asked me why I had done that, and I explained. To my surprise, though I shouldn't really have been surprised, he was pretty hurt and frustrated. He asked that I never do something like that again because he has no reason to hide who he is, especially in his own home. And he was right. It really made me think long and hard about how I hide and or display my faith, and really any aspect of who I am, and what message that might send. I had to reckon with my own prejudices about Christians pushing their faith on others, when really most everyday Christians do not do that. Paulo is the polar opposite of a proselytizer, and it was totally unfair of me to punish him for the stereotype that I was reacting to. Now, does that mean that I wander around dressed head to toe in clothing showing off UUism or Judaism? No. But if I want to use something that shows part of my identity, I do feel more comfortable doing that now, knowing that my purpose is not to pressure anyone, but just to be myself. It was this dark reminder for me that although there are extremists in all faith traditions, the vast majority of people in most of those are just trying to live their lives and are not trying to push their beliefs on anyone else. So I'm thankful for that lesson from him in loving who you are, regardless of what others might think, and not trying to hide it, especially in your own home. Now, our coffee table collection includes Every Person's Guide to Judaism, a Bible, philosopher Mark Nepo's The Book of Awakening, and my personal favorites, Brandon Stanton's photo documentary books, Humans of New York and Humans. And none of them leave because they're all part of who we are. The final lesson I want to share today, which is, I think, the most important, yet sometimes the most difficult one to live out, is doing our best to truly embrace diversity and work to be as inclusive as possible, inviting that diversity to help us grow. This is a bit of a pivot from where I was when we got married and stripped our wedding ceremony of religious elements, and is most definitely a result of our years together in figuring out this whole religion thing. And this is where I think we as UUs have somewhat of a greater charge or responsibility to walk the walk of celebrating and honoring diversity than some other faiths do that are beholden to one story and one story alone. It is in our 7 principles to be accepting of one another, and our 6 sources contain a wide variety of possible truths that, though they can conflict with one another, are supposed to be held up equally just the same. I love this about UUism, that we recognize the existence of multiple truths and even questions that nobody can definitively answer. But it can be hard in practice to treat other beliefs as equally valid if they're not our own. And this is where the experience of living as an interfaith family in interfaith communities has given me some extra practice in doing just that. Now, there's a reason the old adage exists about avoiding religion and politics in polite conversation. They can both be contentious subjects where there is a diversity of opinion. But I also think the contrary can be just as dangerous, where we find ourselves in echo chambers of like-minded people who will tend to only affirm what we say and not challenge us to navigate the nuances of the complex world in which we live. And UUs are not immune to this challenge, as I have personally heard comments made in our church community and made some myself that are unfairly dismissive of other groups of people with beliefs or opinions that may be unpopular here, because we assume that it's in this safe space, it's okay to relegate those who feel differently to stereotypes. Don't get me wrong, safe spaces are essential for most of us as places of acceptance, nurturing, and safe processing of all that life brings us. But I've come to believe that there is some sort of healthy balance, which is most likely different for each individual, between familiar places like our own inner circles and spaces where we engage with the rest of our community who may or may not share our beliefs and develop deep relationships with those who seem different too. I like to think of it as the opposite of cancel culture. When we discover that we disagree with someone, while we might need an occasional break from conversation, we don't cut each other off or write someone off as somehow inferior, but we take a step back once we're ready and understand and try to understand where they are coming from and how we're interconnected. because we're all interconnected deep down. A great example of the progress that can happen when we are able to bridge these gaps is on one of my favorite reality shows ever, Netflix's Queer Eye. If you haven't already seen it, I cannot recommend it enough. It will renew your faith in humanity, and you'll get great fashion and design tips along the way. The specific episode I'm about to describe is in season 2, and it's called God Bless Gay. A double entendre because the episode takes place in the town of Gay, Georgia, but it is also about healing relationships between queer people hurt by the church and the church. I still cannot watch it without getting emotional because it is just such a beautiful example of people breaking down barriers to come together for good. Bobby Burke, one of the Fab Five, as the makeover experts are called, is a queer interior designer who grew up in a deeply conservative evangelical Christian household and had to leave home at the age of 15 to escape a hostile home environment due to his church's teachings about queer sexuality. In his first meeting with the producers of the show, according to an interview he did with the magazine Attitude, he said, quote, "Never ask me to talk about religion, never ask me to go into a church." Well, then they decided to do a makeover of a church for a wonderful woman named Mama Tammy, who was nominated to be one of the show's heroes, as they're called, because of her selfless work for her church community. Part of the makeover included redesigning the church where she worked, which was obviously a serious conflict of interest for Bobby, given his painful history of trauma. The producers apparently tried to refer to it as a community center rather than a church to convince Bobby to do the makeover, but he's no fool and was still resistant. Eventually, the producer apparently called him and said, quote, "Don't do it for the church. Do it for all the little Bobbies who are sitting in those churches. Do it for them in the hope that the church won't do to them what it did to you." And so Bobby says in the article, quote, "I said I'd do it for the kids who are still being taught self-hate." And he did. He remade Mama Tammy's church into an amazing space where the church's work could flourish. It took so much courage on his part to do that. And when she saw the work that he had done, she showered each individual member of the Fab Five team with love and appreciation for their unique talents. And when she came to Bobby, she asked, "What did you learn this week?" And he said he learned to remember where he came from and to, quote, "let go of some of the resentment and to realize that not everyone out there that claims to be Christian is good, but that there are a whole lot out there that are." The next scene shows Mama Tammy's church homecoming celebration, inaugurating the newly renovated space. When Mama Tammy walks in, she is arm in arm with her son Miles, who, despite growing up in the church and loving singing in the choir and always being unconditionally loved by his mother, had walked away from the church because he too is gay and had not felt loved in that church community for who he is. But through the work that he was able to do with the Fab Five, he was able to get to a place where he felt safe and confident enough to re-enter that space. When his mother got up and gave an impassioned speech about the relationship building that went on that week with 6 gay men, the Fab Five and her son, he was leaning in, brimming with joy as she challenged her faith community to love those around them just as they love God, saying, "Do I love Jesus? Yes. Am I a believer? Yes. Do I love my son? Yes, yes, yes." That kind of love and connection is what it's all about, where we can do the often hard work of accepting that we're not all the same, nor do we necessarily agree on everything, but that where we can be in respectful relationship with each other, we can learn and find ways to work together for good. Speaking of stories about our kids, Maria has become obsessed with the question lately, who made the fill in the blank chair, house? I'm still unsure if she does this because she truly wonders about these things or if she asks just because she knows she can capture my attention as I try to answer. But either way, it's been a fun new challenge. Some common ones are, who made this house? Who made Wegmans? Who made this playground? Those often end up with me explaining that someone designed them, then the design was sent to the factory or a contractor where they obtained the materials and the labor to make the components, and then prepare the site and assemble the final product. But it gets a little more complicated when she asked about who made the trees or the sky or this world. At first, I really had to think for a minute on how to answer the world one. And now I often respond with, because again, we love repetition, so I get asked these all the time. Well, there are different theories on that. Some people believe that God created all of that. Some people believe Mother Nature created it. Some people believe nobody did. It was just there after a big explosion. And others aren't sure. It's pretty complicated, huh? Once I asked her what she thought after we discussed theories of the creation of the sky, and she said, I think God did. Another time she asked about the trees, and as I took a second to answer, she said, seeds, Mom. Whichever way of understanding the tough questions of life she ends up ascribing to someday. The only thing I hope is that it will be what's right for her, and that she will also respect those of others too. Thank you for listening to me share my experiences today, and I will leave you with a quote from one of my favorite authors and influencers, Glennon Doyle. And when she wanted to see the face of God, she didn't look up and away. She looked into the eyes of the person sitting right next to her, which is harder, better.
Thank you, Megan. This brings us to our closing hymn. Come sing a song with me.
All right, now is the part in our service where we extinguish the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Thank you all for joining this morning. And thank you, Megan, for sharing such a personal and important story with us all. At this time, I'm going to be setting up the coffee hour rooms where we invite you to stay and chat with the other folks here. You can click to join the breakout room and stay and visit for a while.